My parents are kneeling on the emergency room floor, flattering a student nurse just to ask about Monica, the woman they call their only child. My father, Jerry, grips a stack of hospital bills he cannot pay, his voice trembling with a desperation he never once showed me in 35 years. When I step out in my white coat, the silver chief of surgery badge reflecting the cold fluorescent lights, he does not embrace me. He points a finger at me, his teeth gritted. "Where did you get that coat, Irene? How much longer are you going to lie to us?" I stand motionless under the white lights. I feel the cold hospital air against my skin. I do not blink. My fingers only tighten slightly around the $45,000 guarantee I just signed to save the life of the sister who told the world I was dead. My father has no idea that Aunt Ruth is standing at the end of the hallway with the folder that will prove Monica did not just lie about my life. She profited from my absence to seize every cent of the $250,000 inheritance my grandmother left behind. Hello to all of you, the women who have spent your lives carrying the weight of your families in silence. Today is about the cost of truth in a house where a lie is worshipped like a religion. Let us go back 5 years, to the day I was exiled with a single phone call from my sister. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator in Mercy Rest's trauma bay cuts through the sterile air, a steady, mechanical wheeze that keeps Monica anchored to this side of existence, while the world I thought I had buried stands right in front of me. Jerry and Diane are here, occupying the space with a frantic, misplaced energy that smells of old leather and desperation. Jerry's eyes are fixed on me, but there is no recognition in them. No softening of the features I once shared. There is only a frozen, calcified hostility directed at a stranger wearing a white lab coat. As my fingers brush the silver nameplate pinned to my chest, the coldness of the metal acts as a conductor, pulling my mind back 25 years to a kitchen in Hartford. It was the last place I was ever allowed to feel like a person of value, a sanctuary built of sunlight and the scent of baking cinnamon. In that kitchen, the afternoon light used to pool on the oak table, illuminating the deep, jagged grain of the wood where I would trace the patterns with my index finger. I can still feel the texture of that table, the way the worn finish felt smooth in some places and dangerously rough in others. On top of that table sat a plastic medical kit, a birthday gift from my grandmother Jun when I turned 10. I remember picking up the toy stethoscope, the blue plastic feeling cheap and cold against my palm. I would press the flat diaphragm to my own chest, listening to the muffled thump of my heart through the plastic tubes, feeling the warmth of my own life force transferring into the inanimate object. My eyes never left Grandmother June. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her slender, bony hands steady as she peeled apples with a small, wooden-handled knife. The rhythm of her work was a silent commitment to safety, a promise that as long as she was there, the world could not tilt too far on its axis. Grandmother Jun stopped her work and set the knife down on the cutting board with a soft, hollow thud. She turned toward me, her presence filling the small space with a quiet, unconditional warmth. She reached out and placed a hand on the top of my head, her dry, papery skin sliding into my hair and stroking the back of my neck. I stood perfectly still, letting the weight of her hand anchor me. The heat from her palm seeped through my thin t-shirt, loosening the tension that always seemed to live in my shoulders even back then. She leaned down, her eyes meeting mine without a shred of judgment, only a reflection of a child who is being fully seen and cherished. In that kitchen, I wasn't a problem to be solved, or a shadow of my sister. I was Irene, and I was enough. The memory shattering is a physical sensation, like glass splintering in the back of my throat. Jerry takes a sudden step forward, his heavy leather shoes striking the hospital tile with a harsh, echoing crack that vibrates up my spine. He reaches out, his rough, calloused fingers snagging the lapel of my lab coat, the white cotton bunching and wrinkling under the pressure of his palm. His eyes are wide, the tiny red vessels in the whites of them visible as he leans in, his breath a thick cloud of stale coffee and agitation. He doesn't look at my face. He stares at the silver nameplate as if the metal itself is an insult to his reality. "Take that fake tag off right now," he says, his voice a low, gritting snarl. "Are you really trying to use a costume to swindle us while Monica is lying in there dying?" I take a step back, my shoulders instinctively shrinking as a reflex from a decade of survival kicks into gear. My hands hang limp at my sides, my fingers curling into my palms, feeling the high-quality texture of the hospital-issued cotton beneath my skin. Diane stands just behind him, a silent observer in expensive heels. She doesn't look at me. She stares at the tips of her own shoes, her lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. She clutches her handbag against her chest as if maintaining a physical barrier between herself and a pathogen. To them, I am not a surgeon. I am not the woman who just reviewed the imaging for the intracranial pressure Monica is currently fighting. I am the story they agreed to tell the world, a narrative of failure and theft that they cannot allow the truth to disrupt. Slowly, I lift my hands. My fingers are steady, the practiced movements of a trauma surgeon overriding the trembling of the girl from Hartford. I wrap my hand around Jerry's wrist. I don't push him away, but I hold him with a calculated force, a grip that informs him exactly where the power in this room currently resides. I take a deep breath, feeling my ribs expand, pushing back the suffocating sensation that had begun to rise in my chest. I shift my gaze from the floor to a point just above Jerry's shoulder, focusing on the calm, pale blue paint of the hospital wall. It is a landmark of the present, a reminder that I am no longer in the house where my voice was a ghost. My thumb brushes against the sharp edge of a hemostat tucked into my pocket, the slight sting of the metal against my skin acting as a needle, pinning me to the here and now. I consciously roll my shoulders back, feeling each vertebra align under the lab coat until I am standing at my full height. I reach up and smooth out the wrinkles Jerry's hand left on my collar, my movements slow and precise, the same way I would close an open wound. I reclaim the space, millimeter by millimeter under their witness. I see Jerry's eyes flicker, a momentary lapse in his certainty as he realizes the person he is trying to intimidate is no longer there. I realize then that in the house Jerry and Diane built, time stopped 5 years ago. To them, I am still the girl Monica wrote out of the family history, the addict she invented to cover her own tracks. It doesn't matter that I have spent thousands of hours in the operating room or that this coat represents the weight of lives saved. The truth of who I am is less important to them than the lie they have chosen to worship. I am the one who allowed them to keep that power for so long, feeding it with my own silence, hoping that if I just disappeared enough, they would eventually see what was left. But I am finished being a shadow. The silence is ending, but it isn't going to end with a scream. It is going to end with a scalpel. I turn my body away from them, toward the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit, where Monica lies amidst a sea of monitoring equipment. They have no idea who is actually paying for the round-the-clock specialists or the experimental shunt that is currently keeping their daughter's brain from swelling into the base of her skull. A family system built on the theft of one child's worth is about to collide with the cold, financial reality they've spent a lifetime hiding behind my back. The memory of those Hartford dinners does not return with the warmth of a shared meal or the soft hum of family chatter. Instead, it comes back as the physical weight of paper, the sharp corners of utility bills tucked deep into the back of a kitchen drawer where guests would never think to look. Jerry and Diane spoke often of the beauty of shared sacrifice, their voices carrying a practiced rhythmic quality when they talked to the neighbors about the strength of the Ulet bond. But in the quiet hours of that house, sacrifice was a one-way street, a silent transaction where I functioned as the invisible engine and Monica existed as the sparkling facade. We had our roles, fixed and immutable as the furniture in the den. I was the one who kept the lights on and the insurance premiums current, while Monica was the daughter they could actually show off to the world. I sat at the oak dining table, my shoulders already pulling downward under the weight of a thin cardigan after a 12-hour shift that had started before dawn. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic metallic clicking of my laptop keys. The sound felt loud in the stillness, a dry staccato that echoed against the polished wood. I kept my head down, my eyes tracing the rows of numbers on the screen, cross-referencing them with the stack of electricity statements and Medicare Part B copay notices that lay scattered beside a cold, forgotten cup of coffee. I could feel the fatigue beginning to migrate from my lower back into the very marrow of my palms as I navigated the bank portals, executing the silent transfers that kept my parents' world from tilting into insolvency. Each click was a small, unacknowledged tether holding their lifestyle together. Across the room, the atmosphere was entirely different. Monica was sprawled on Jerry's oversized lazy-boy recliner, her legs draped over a pile of soft velvet pillows that had been moved from the formal living room just for her comfort. The blue light from her tablet cast a ghostly, flickering glow over her face, highlighting an expression of absolute relaxation. She was smiling, her lips curving slightly at whatever video was playing on her screen, her body loose and unburdened by the concept of a deadline. She reached out toward a crystal bowl on the side table, her fingers selecting a single grape with a slow, casual grace. She didn't notice the sharp, shallow quality of my breathing or the way I was hunched over the tax documents I was trying to finalize for the household. To her, the comfort of that chair and the abundance in that bowl were simply the natural state of things, as inevitable as the sunrise. Diane entered the room then, carrying a silver tray with a delicate, practiced elegance. On it sat a glass of warm milk and a small plate of cinnamon biscuits, their scent wafting through the air and momentarily masking the smell of my stale coffee. She glided past me without a glance at the open spreadsheets or the red-inked notices I was trying to hide under my forearm. The hem of her skirt brushed against the leg of the table, causing a small stack of papers to shift and flutter, but she didn't stop to write them. She placed the tray on the small table next to Monica, her hand reaching out to brush a stray hair from Monica's forehead, with the kind of tenderness one might reserve for a fragile piece of porcelain. Her eyes were full of a quiet, intense admiration for the daughter who was doing nothing, completely ignoring the hollowed-out look of my face under the weak glow of the desk lamp. Jerry followed close behind, his footsteps heavy but controlled. He was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope, and a rare, genuine smile spread across his face as he set it gently on Monica's lap. She looked up, her eyes widening as she opened the seal and let out a small, delighted gasp. Jerry didn't look at me, but I saw his brow furrow when the sound of my typing resumed. He tapped his fingers against the oak surface of the table right next to my laptop, a sharp, dry sound that functioned as a reprimand for my intrusion into their quiet moment. He pulled up a chair next to Monica, leaning in to discuss her latest plans for a theater workshop in the city, his voice full of an expansive, hopeful energy. I sat there with my hands suspended over the keys, my skin pale and waxy from a lack of sleep, completely erased from the conversation about the future I was currently financing. I stood up slowly, my fingers gripping the edge of the laptop so hard that my knuckles turned the color of bone. I gathered the paid bills, stacking them into a neat, silent pile, and sliding them into the deepest drawer of the kitchen cabinet. I made no sound, my movements as efficient and invisible as they had always been, my eyes fixed on the graying grain of the wood. I could feel my heart thumping against the base of my throat, a frantic, trapped bird, but I kept my lips pressed together. There would be no explanation of the hours I had spent on the phone with the insurance adjusters. No mention of the overtime shifts I had picked up to cover Jerry's rising premiums. I remained a statue, a ghost in my own skin, preparing to fade into the shadows of the hallway so they could continue their celebration undisturbed. I moved toward the kitchen sink, picking up the half-empty wine glass Monica had left on the floor near the sofa. I turned on the cold water, letting the freezing stream pour over my hands until they were numb, the chill seeping into my very bones. I used a sponge to scrub the glass, my movements mechanical and fierce. My eyes locked on the white soap suds as they swirled down the drain. My shoulders slumped, but my hands didn't stop their work, cleaning up the debris of their evening as if it were the only price I could pay for the right to exist under that roof. I was a reservoir they tapped whenever the well ran dry, a silent guarantor of a peace I was never invited to share. I realized then that in this house, my value was measured only by the debt I could erase and the silence I could maintain. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a nameless reserve fund, a safety net that allowed Monica to lie there and dream of stage lights while I stood in the dark, with hands chapped from soap and exhaustion. Every time Diane stroked Monica's hair, she was using my labor to buy the pride she felt, a cruel, emotional theft that I had unwittingly facilitated for years. I had built the walls of their sanctuary with my own depletion, thinking that if I just did enough, they would eventually notice the person behind the payments. That invisibility had provided the perfect soil for Monica to plant a different kind of story when I wasn't in the room. She wasn't just taking the attention and the resources anymore. She was beginning to construct a narrative designed to strip away the only thing I had left, which was the truth of who I was. These silent resentments were accumulating like silt at the bottom of a river, waiting for the slightest nudge to overflow into a total campaign of exile. Monica had seen how easily my parents chose the lie over the person, and she was preparing to give them the biggest lie of all. But as I dried the last glass and stared at my reflection in the darkened window above the sink, I knew the engine was beginning to smoke. The system they relied on was brittle, held together by a daughter who was finally starting to feel the coldness of the water she was drowning in. Monica was already rehearsing her next act, a performance that would turn my parents' favoritism into a mechanism of total expulsion. She didn't realize that a reservoir, once empty, leaves behind nothing but a cracked and hollow ground that can no longer support the weight of a house built on lies. The pressure did not always announce itself with a shout. It began to shift, transforming from the heavy silence of the kitchen into a series of sharp, jagged words wrapped in the artificial honey of Jerry's concern. The economic downturn of that year provided the perfect scaffolding for his demands, a righteous excuse to tighten the perimeter around my life. He used the concept of family love as a set of iron bars, insisting that I retreat further into the shadows to ensure the light remained fixed on Monica. We were inside the cramped cabin of the old SUV, the air thick with the smell of aging plastic and the stifling, dry heat of a failing ventilation system. We were on our way to a celebration for Monica's supposed promotion, and I realized, watching the back of Jerry's head, that my own voice had been confiscated long before I ever thought to use it in my own defense. I sat in the back seat, my temple pressed against the cold vibration of the window glass, my eyes fixed on the streaks of streetlights that blurred past like silver wires. My hands were locked around the worn leather straps of my handbag, the rough stitching digging into my palms as Jerry suddenly engaged the brakes, sending my body lurching toward the front. I pulled myself back, shrinking into the corner of the door to avoid touching the upholstery of Diane's seat. My breathing was short and shallow, each exhale creating a small, ghostly fog on the glass that separated me from the world outside. Jerry's hands were clamped onto the steering wheel, his knuckles a stark, bloodless white under the dull red glow of the dashboard lights. He caught my eye in the rearview mirror, his gaze sharp and measuring, like a hunter assessing the distance between himself and a target in a confined space. He adjusted the mirror with a sudden, jerky motion, locking my vision into the frame of his furrowed brows. I could feel the vibration of the engine humming through the floorboards, traveling up into my numb feet, while the air inside the car grew dense and depleted of oxygen. Irene, you have to understand that your mother and I sacrificed our entire youth to make sure you got that degree, Jerry said, his voice dropping into a low, practiced register of disappointment. He slapped the flat of his hand against the steering wheel, a dull thud that made me jump, though he didn't turn his head. He began to tap a rhythmic beat with his thumb against the faux leather rim, emphasizing every word. He told me that since the family was going through a difficult patch, I couldn't be selfish enough to keep my savings for a medical residency, while Monica needed support to maintain her new position. Family comes first, Irene, he reminded me, the words heavy with the weight of a debt I had never agreed to carry. He reached out and turned the radio dial, letting a thin stream of jazz fill the cabin, the smooth notes acting as a polite shroud for the accusation he had just leveled against me. The music created an atmosphere of forced civility, a polished cage that made every pore on my skin feel as though it were slamming shut. Diane shifted in her seat, turning halfway around so that her hand rested on Jerry's shoulder in a gesture of silent agreement. Her eyes were fixed on me, filled with a performance of disappointed pleading that felt more restrictive than any physical barrier. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small lace handkerchief, twisting the fabric into a tight knot before smoothing it out again over her knee. She tilted her head, her shadow blocking a portion of my view out the windshield, forcing me to confront the manufactured sorrow on her face. This repetitive motion with the handkerchief acted as a countdown, an accumulation of pressure against my nerves that made the back seat feel smaller with every passing mile. She didn't have to speak to confirm Jerry's words. Her presence was the anchor that kept his narrative tied to the ground. I remained perfectly still, my eyes glued to the rain droplets racing down the glass, counting them as a way to keep my internal architecture from collapsing. I bit the inside of my cheek until I could taste the faint metallic hint of blood, but I didn't move my hand to wipe it away. I allowed my body to go flat, attempting to become part of the old leather seat, a strategy of total non-existence. I felt the chill from the window seeping through my coat and into my ribs, but I did not shift my weight. I focused on making my breathing mechanical and rhythmic, a desperate attempt to hide the way my diaphragm was nodding with a silent, trapped scream. My fingers moved secretly inside my bag, tracing the hard plastic edges of my credit card, the last physical piece of autonomy I had managed to keep out of their reach. I swallowed hard, the sensation of a stone lodged in my throat making it difficult to breathe, but I didn't offer a rebuttal. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod that Jerry could see in the mirror, a calculated surrender meant to stop the barrage of his voice. I closed my eyes, imagining myself standing in the middle of an empty field where the only sound was the wind, letting the exhaustion of the role wash over me. I realized then that in Jerry's dictionary, love was a debt contract I had signed the moment I was born. Every success I achieved was treated as communal family property, while every failure was my private sin to bear alone. He didn't need to use physical strength to break me. He only needed the memory of his past sacrifices to imprison my future. This sweetened, maternal love was crueler than any abandonment because it demanded that I dismantle my own dreams with my own hands in the name of family morality. I was being asked to pay for the privilege of my existence by sacrificing the very thing that made that existence worthwhile. The accumulation of this silence was pushing me toward a fracture point, a place where the quiet safety I had built was becoming a volatile pressure cooker. I was beginning to see that staying silent was no longer a method of survival. It was a form of slow-motion disappearance. But before I could find the words to reclaim the space I occupied, Monica had already moved to the next stage of her script. She had seen the way my parents worshipped the version of me she had sold them, and she was preparing to release the final, most devastating lie. It was a narrative designed to turn their favoritism into a permanent exile, a story that would transform me from a silent provider into an active enemy of the house. I could feel the atmosphere shifting as we pulled into the driveway. The restaurant's neon sign flickered like a warning, a prelude to the calculated performance Monica was about to unveil. The heavy wooden door of room 402 clicked shut behind me, a sound so final it seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes and into the marrow of my bones. It carried away Sarah's last shallow breath and the final remains of the small, fragile world I had been trying to sustain with nothing but sheer willpower and overtime shifts. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. The hospital corridor was flooded with the harsh, bleached glare of neon lights that made everything look two-dimensional and brittle. There was no sound except for the rhythmic, hollow squeak of my rubber-soled shoes against the vinyl floor as I walked toward the exit. I stood there for a moment by the elevators, surrounded by the heavy silence of strangers behind closed doors, while the phone in my pocket buzzed one last time. It wasn't a call to ask if I was all right, or if I had eaten. It was a notification from the primary number I still called home, informing me that I had been blocked from the only family network I had left. I walked out into the gray, early morning of Hartford, the drizzle turning the pavement into a slick, obsidian mirror. I found my old car in the back corner of the parking lot, the metal cold and damp as I pulled the handle. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut with a dry, metallic thud that seemed to sever the connection between me and the warmth of the hospital building. I placed both hands on the steering wheel, my thin, tired fingers gripping the peeling plastic cover until the textured bumps pressed deep into my palms. I could see my knuckles turning a bloodless white in the dim light of the cabin. I leaned my head back against the headrest, my uneven breathing creating a thick, translucent fog on the windshield that blurred the world into a series of gray smears. My shoulders felt heavy, pinned down by the weight of my damp coat and the absolute exhaustion of a week spent watching a life flicker out. I sat there, staring at the digital clock on the dashboard as the numbers jumped to 0514, my eyes unblinking and dry. I reached into my bag and pulled out Sarah's final hospital bill, the paper crumpled and damp from the humidity of the car. My index finger traced the summary line at the bottom, moving slowly across the rows of zeros that represented the total collapse of my financial reserves. I followed the numbers until the tip of my finger snagged on a corner of the paper, causing a tiny, jagged tear. I laid the bill across my lap and pressed both of my hands flat against it, applying the full weight of my body as if I could physically crush the evidence of my own bankruptcy. I felt my legs begin to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that started in my ankles and worked its way up to my thighs. I stared at the dashboard, watching a single bead of water trail down the glass, while the air in the car began to feel thin and insufficient. I pressed the button to play the voicemail from Jerry one last time, letting his cold, flat voice fill the cramped space. He told me never to show my face in Hartford again, his words sharp and discarded like rusted nails. He said Monica had shown them the truth about what I was, and that I was no longer considered a child of that house. When the recording ended, I let the phone slip from my hand, watching it fall onto the stained floor mat with a muffled thud that was instantly swallowed by the sound of rain drumming on the roof. I pulled my feet up onto the seat and wrapped my arms around my knees, pressing my chin hard against my kneecaps until the sharp pain radiated through my jaw. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I simply sat there in the dark, my eyes wide and fixed on the empty space where the world used to be. My shoulders began to shake, a series of short, dry hitches that felt like they were being torn from my chest. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed a scarf, a thick woolen thing my mother had knitted for me when I was 10 years old. I pressed it against my face, inhaling the smell of dust and the faint, lingering scent of the cedar chest where it had been stored for decades. The tears didn't come in drops. They came in a steady, hot stream that soaked into the coarse wool, leaving dark, heavy patches against the fabric. I gripped the scarf so tightly that my fingernails dug into the palms of my hands, leaving angry, red crescents in the skin. I stayed like that for a long time, curled into a ball in the corner of the driver's seat, letting the silence of the parking lot witness the final dismantling of the daughter I had tried so hard to be. Suddenly, I stopped. I pulled the scarf away and let it drop onto the floorboards like a piece of cooling lead. I used the back of my hand to wipe the dampness from my cheeks, my movements decisive and harsh as I dragged my skin from my cheekbones down to my chin. I sat up straight and adjusted the rearview mirror, forced to look at my own reflection. My eyes were rimmed with red, but the pupils had shrunk into two sharp black points that showed no trace of a plea for mercy. There was no hesitation left in the frame of my face. I opened the center console and pulled out a plastic comb, beginning to work through my tangled hair with long, straight strokes that went from the crown of my head to my shoulders. I looked at my own medical board certification and the file from the surgical residency program sitting on the back seat. I reached back and placed it carefully in the center of the dashboard. I tapped my fingers against the cover, a dry, rhythmic sound like a knock on a door that was never meant to be opened. I took a deep breath, expanding my lungs until they pressed against my ribs, before I reached forward and turned the key in the ignition. I realized then that in the house in Hartford, love wasn't a harbor. It was a cage woven out of Monica's lies and my parents' willingness to believe them. Jerry and Diane had closed the door themselves, and Sarah's death had finally stripped away the illusion that my sacrifice would ever be enough to earn my way back in. I saw clearly that the act of disappearing for people who refuse to see you is nothing more than a slow, quiet suicide. I wasn't going to be their Irene anymore. I was going to be the truth they were too cowardly to face. If you have ever had to wipe your own tears in the dark because you realize the people who were supposed to love you the most were the ones who caused the deepest damage, then you know that this silence isn't a defeat. It is a preparation. Please leave a comment and share your own moment of clarity, so I know I am not the only one who had to burn the house down to finally breathe the air outside. The car rolled slowly out of the hospital parking lot, heading toward the highway that led back to Hartford. I wasn't going back to ask for forgiveness or to explain the bills or the long nights at Sarah's bedside. In the trunk of my car sat the original file the medical school had just returned to me, along with a handwritten letter from Aunt Ruth that spoke of a missing $5,000 deposit. Every piece of the betrayal was finally in my hands, categorized and cold. I drove through the gray morning light, my hands steady on the wheel, feeling the weight of the evidence pressing against the frame of the car. The storm that Monica had invited into the family room was about to meet the surgical precision of the person she thought she had erased. I returned to the house in Hartford on a Friday afternoon, wearing the heavy, ill-fitting coat of a daughter who had finally run out of places to hide. I had spent the drive practicing the specific slump of my shoulders and the way to keep my eyes fixed on the floor, adopting the posture of someone who had been hollowed out by the very failures Monica had so carefully curated for me. Diane opened the door with a smile that was thick with the sweetness of an unearned victory. Her eyes didn't settle on my face. They went straight to the frayed strap of the cheap synthetic handbag I was carrying, a deliberate prop I had chosen to confirm her narrative of my professional collapse. She smelled of that same artificial lavender oil that always seemed to coat every surface of the foyer, a scent meant to signal domestic peace while masking the rot of the floorboards beneath. I bowed my head, letting my hair fall forward to obscure the cold, clinical clarity in my eyes, and stepped back into the world of shadows, where the truth was a currency they had long since devalued. I waited until the house settled into its mid-afternoon lull, that specific time when Diane retreated to the sunroom with her crossword puzzles, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock was the only thing marking the passage of time. I moved toward Jerry's private study, the door creaking slightly as I pushed it open. The room was a museum of his self-importance, smelling of heavy oak and the stale, lingering ghost of expensive tobacco. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pair of thin, latex surgical gloves, the material snapping against my skin with a sound that felt like a secret. I knelt beside the massive desk, my fingers moving without sound as I navigated the drawers he had kept meticulously lubricated. I found the navy blue folder at the very bottom of the locked cabinet, the metal of the file rail cold against my knuckles. I turned the pages with the tip of my index finger, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers on the joint family bank statements with the same precision I used to read a complicated MRI. I stopped at the entry for March 14th, a large withdrawal that had never been explained to the board. I pulled out my phone. The screen brightness turned to its lowest setting and captured each page without the intrusion of a flash, my breathing remaining even and silent in the dim light of the study. I reached further back into the shadows of the desk and pulled out a plain white envelope without a return address. Inside were the receipts from a private rehabilitation center in Portland, the very documents Monica had used to justify the emergency loan she had taken from my parents' retirement fund. I laid them out on the oak surface, using a small metal ruler I found in the pen cup to compare the alignment of the signatures with those on the old Christmas cards Monica had sent years ago. The slant of the M and the way the ink pooled at the end of the last name were identical to her theatrical handwriting, a clumsy forgery that Jerry's pride had prevented him from ever questioning. Every movement I made was short, efficient, and devoid of wasted energy. I returned every document to its exact position, using a small microfiber cloth to wipe away the faint traces of my presence from the mahogany finish before closing the drawer until the tiny click of the lock signaled the return of his perceived security. Aunt Ruth was waiting for me on the back porch when I slipped out a few minutes later, her silhouette small and sharp against the fading afternoon light. She didn't say a word as she held out a thick file folder, the red legal stamp of a law office visible even in the shadows. I took the folder with both hands, feeling the weight and the textured roughness of the heavy cardstock against my palms. I didn't look her in the eye. I focused on the words, Last Will and Testament, embossed on the cover, my fingers involuntarily tightening around the edges until the paper began to curl. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the biting chill of the evening air, feeling a new kind of weight settle onto my shoulders. Aunt Ruth reached up and pressed her dry, weathered palm against my cheek for a fleeting second, her eyes narrowing as she glanced toward the living room window where Diane's shadow was cast against the lace curtains. I stepped back, sliding the folder inside the oversized lining of my coat, holding it tight against my ribs, while my other hand adjusted my collar in a natural, defensive motion. I gave a small, silent nod, my lips pressed into a thin line as I felt my heart thumping against the legal evidence of Grandmother June's true intentions. I walked back into the living room, my footsteps heavy and deliberate enough to announce my return to the space. I sat down in the old wingback chair opposite Diane, my hands folded neatly on my knees, my eyes lowered to hide the sharpening focus within. I reached out and took the teacup she offered, my fingers brushing the hot porcelain without flinching as the heat radiated into my skin. I brought the cup to my lips and took a small, measured sip, letting the jasmine tea coat my throat while I maintained a mask of total composure. I began to feed her a story of my supposed remorse, my voice dropping an octave, steady and rhythmic, devoid of any hesitation. I watched her through my lashes, recording every micro-expression on her face, the way her lips curled in triumph, the relaxed slump of her shoulders as she leaned back into the sofa, convinced she was witnessing my final surrender. I offered her a small mechanical smile, the kind that only touched the corners of my eyes, while I felt a cold, deep-seated contempt rising in my chest at how easily she accepted the role of the merciful victor over the daughter she had helped to break. In that room, heavy with the scent of lavender and the weight of 5 years of lies, Jerry and Diane had no idea that the broken girl they thought they had retrieved was gone. In her place sat a chief of surgery performing a psychological operation without the benefit of anesthesia. Every bit of their current self-satisfaction was only serving to make the coming collapse more absolute. I was playing by their rules now, occupying the role of the dutiful, repentant lamb while I waited for the moment Monica would arrive with the forged codicil in her hand. The truth didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It only needed to be placed in the right hands at the precise moment the theater of their family life reached its crescendo. The weight of the envelopes in the trunk of my car felt like a physical presence. 47 individual packets of reality waiting to be distributed. I had spent the previous night in my apartment, the air conditioner humming a low, lonely tune while I sorted the evidence. I remember the sound of the paper sliding into the envelopes, a crisp, dry noise that felt like a countdown. Each address I wrote was a landmark of my childhood. Aunts who had stopped calling, cousins who had unfriended me based on a story they never bothered to verify. I didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. I felt the cold, steady focus that comes when you are scrubbed in for a 10-hour procedure, where one wrong move means everything is lost. I was no longer a victim of their narrative. I was the architect of its conclusion. Thanksgiving was approaching, and Monica had already announced her plan for a grand surprise for the entire family. She had no idea that while she was busy booking the most expensive restaurant in Hartford, I was preparing the final seating chart for a different kind of ceremony. The dinner that was meant to be the final celebration of my sister's ascension was about to become a courtroom of public record. Jerry and Diane were about to experience exactly what it felt like to have the community they worshipped turn their backs on the very system they had spent a lifetime protecting at my expense. The silence that had nearly killed me was about to become the loudest sound in the room, and I was the only one who knew the music was about to stop. The chandeliers at the Capitol Grill cast a thick, amber glow over the table, the kind of artificial warmth designed to make everything look settled and successful. It blurred the lines of the 47 faces gathered around the long, white-clothed tables, creating a golden haze that masked the calculations happening behind the smiles. There was a wall of sound surrounding me, a chaotic blend of heavy silverware clinking against porcelain, the rhythmic pouring of a deep red Cabernet, and the forced, boisterous laughter of the Ouellette clan. Jerry sat at the head of the table, his chest expanded with the visible satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally maneuvered every piece into its proper place. I sat at the far corner, anchored by the weight of the envelopes hidden in the coat hanging on the back of my chair, watching him with the detached curiosity of a surgeon observing a procedure that had already failed. Diane leaned across the table toward me, her movements fluid and practiced as she navigated the space between the crystal water goblets. She used a heavy silver spoon to place the largest slice of herb-roasted turkey onto my plate, her diamond rings catching the candlelight as she worked. She reached out and placed her hand over my forearm, her fingers stroking my skin with a softness that was meant to look like a mother welcoming a wayward child back to the fold for the benefit of the aunts watching from the other end. She leaned in, her voice a warm, honeyed whisper. "You look so tired, honey," she said, her fingers lingering on my wrist until I could feel the pulse of my own heartbeat against her palm. "It is so good to have you home where you belong, where we can take care of you." Jerry raised his glass then, tapping the rim once with his steak knife to command the room. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the chatter like a bell. He looked at me with a smile that carried no trace of the snarl I had seen in the hospital hallway just hours before. He spoke to the room about new beginnings and the grace of family forgiveness, his voice resonant and fatherly, drawing a collective murmur of approval from the relatives. He leaned over and touched the rim of his glass to mine, the chime of the crystal echoing in the quiet space he had created, a public seal on a private lie. The smile remained on Jerry's face, fixed and immobile. But as the first course was cleared, the energy beneath the table shifted. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and produced a slim leather folder, sliding it across the white tablecloth toward me. He used his index finger to press down on the edge of the paper, guiding it until it came to rest just beside my dinner plate, partially obscured by the heavy linen napkin. He did not look at me as he did it. He kept his gaze fixed on his brother across the table, discussing the merits of the local real estate market with a casual, booming confidence. He produced a black Montblanc fountain pen, its gold trim gleaming under the chandelier, and laid it horizontally across the document. His finger tapped once, a dry, singular sound, right next to the empty signature line at the bottom of the page. "Irene," he said, his voice now a low, businesslike drone that did not carry past our immediate circle, "to show you are serious about this fresh start and that you truly value this family, just sign this acknowledgement. It is a small formality, so Monica can manage the estate more effectively while you focus on getting your life back together. It is the last thing we will ever ask of you." Monica sat on his other side, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a cloth before letting it rest over the header of the legal document. She leaned toward me, her eyes narrowing into thin, dark slits, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat on the wood. She pushed the basket of sourdough rolls toward me, using the edge of the wicker to shove the folder closer to my hand, forcing me to feel the coldness of the paper against my skin, while she described her plans to buy a summer house for our parents to a nearby cousin. I sat motionless, my hands resting in my lap, and I felt Jerry lean in until his breath was hot against my cheek, smelling of the expensive wine and the metallic tang of old age. The mask of the benevolent father flickered and died for a fraction of a second, his facial muscles tightening into a mask of pure, concentrated pressure. He reached under the table and wrapped his hand around my forearm, his grip so tight his nails dug through the thin wool of my sweater and into the skin. He squeezed until a dull, throbbing ache radiated up toward my shoulder, a physical warning of the consequences of staying silent. "Look at the people in this room, Irene," he whispered, his teeth nearly touching my ear. "Don't make this a scene you can't come back from." Diane's demeanor shifted in unison, the warmth evaporating from her eyes until they were as flat and gray as a winter sea. She signaled to a few of my cousins with a sharp, imperceptible nod, and I felt the weight of 47 sets of eyes turning toward our corner of the table. A wall of silent, judgmental pressure. She picked up her dessert fork and struck the edge of her plate with a deliberate, jarring force that cut through the remaining laughter. She looked at the Montblanc pen and then back at me, her expression making it clear that their patience had reached its absolute limit, and the expulsion would be total if I did not pick up that pen. I looked down at the document. The legal language was a blur of clauses and waivers, but the signature line was stark and black. The pen reflected the light of the candles, a sleek object that reminded me of a snake waiting for a moment of weakness. The 3 waves of their attack were perfect, a choreographed movement between affection, interest, and fear. They believed they were dealing with the person they had spent 5 years erasing, the daughter who would eventually buckle under the weight of her own isolation. They had no idea that I was counting the seconds, watching the red light on Monica's phone as she continued to record her live stream for her followers, waiting for the exact moment when the pride of the Ulette name would become the weight that sank them all. I felt the familiar, cold focus of the operating room settle over me, the steady rhythm of a surgeon who knew exactly where the first incision needed to be made. I reached out slowly, my fingers long and steady as I wrapped them around the heavy, cold barrel of the Montblanc. I pressed my thumb against the cap, and the small, singular click of the mechanism was the only sound I heard in the room. Jerry's eyes crinkled in a triumphant smile, his grip on my arm loosening just enough for me to breathe. I did not press the nib to the paper. I held it exactly 1 centimeter above the signature line, the gold point hovering in the air like a needle. I looked up, my eyes meeting Jerry's with a clarity that finally made him flinch. "I think the room would be very interested to know about the $250,000 Monica took from the estate before I even pick up this pen," I said, my voice carrying across the quieted table like a cold, sharp wind. The clatter of silverware against fine porcelain stopped with a suddenness that made the air in the Capitol grill feel heavy and airless. My father's eyes narrowed, the skin around his sockets tightening as the triumph I had seen earlier curdled into a sharp, jagged suspicion. He didn't move, but I could feel the heat radiating from his body, his breath still smelling of the vintage Cabernet, and the absolute certainty of his own power. The 47 relatives seated around the long, white-draped table began to lower their voices, their private conversations dissolving into a singular, expectant silence that rippled outward from my chair. The atmosphere of the manufactured family reunion was being pushed back by a cold, clinical wave of reality, the kind of stillness that usually precedes the first incision in a trauma bay. I didn't look at the aunts or the cousins who had spent the last hour pretending I was invisible. I kept my eyes on Jerry, watching the way a small muscle in his jaw began to twitch rhythmically against the silence. I let the Mont Blanc pen slip from my fingers, watching it roll slowly across the white tablecloth until it came to a halt right against the rim of Jerry's plate. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer, my hand moving with a deliberate, unhurried precision, and pulled out a folder protected by a translucent blue plastic sleeve. I laid it down directly over the waiver Monica had spent the evening trying to force me to sign. My fingers were steady, devoid of the tremors that used to define my presence in this house. I began to spread 3 specific documents across the table, smoothing them out one by one. First, the certified letter from the medical school with the official red seal, confirming my graduation and my standing as chief of surgery. Then, the original copy of Grandmother Jun's will, the one that hadn't been modified by Monica's hand. I kept my gaze fixed on the intricate embroidery of the tablecloth, refusing to look up as I felt the collective weight of 47 sets of eyes focusing on the bold, black ink of the truth. I leaned back slightly, my spine a straight, unyielding line that did not touch the velvet upholstery of the chair. I folded my hands on my lap and took a slow, deep breath, expanding my lungs against the pressure of the room, waiting for the man who had signed my birth certificate to acknowledge the daughter he had tried to erase. The silence lasted only until Jerry's brain could no longer reconcile the paper in front of him with the lie he had been told. He didn't just stand, he erupted, the force of his movement sending the heavy mahogany chair backward until it struck the glass partition of the dining room with a resounding, hollow crack. The sound echoed through the restaurant, drawing the attention of the other patrons, but Jerry didn't care about the image of the perfect family anymore. He swung his arm in a wide, uncontrolled arc, his hand striking his wine glass and sending the dark red liquid splashing across the white linen and the documents with the red seals. The wine looked like old blood on a sterile sheet, seeping into the fibers and staining the edges of my hard-earned credentials. His lips were trembling, pulling back to reveal gritted teeth as his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He slammed both of his palms down onto the table, making the plates jump and the silverware rattle in a discordant chorus of porcelain and metal. "Irene, you are a heartless, cold-blooded creature," he spat, his voice a low, vibrating snarl that made the cousins nearest to him push their chairs back in alarm. "I wish I had never put my name on your birth certificate if this is the face of the daughter I have to look at." Diane stood just behind him, her hands clenched so tightly into balls that her knuckles looked like white stones. She snatched up a linen napkin, wringing it into a tight, knotted lump before throwing it directly at my chest. It struck my shoulder and fell to the floor, a useless gesture of a woman who had run out of ways to control the narrative. She began to chant a series of low, guttural curses, her voice cracking as the carefully maintained veneer of the Hartford socialite fell away to reveal something much older and more jagged. The relatives began to scramble, the sound of chair legs scraping against the heavy carpet creating a chaotic, dissonant noise. Some of them covered their mouths, their eyes darting between the stained documents and the man they had once respected. Monica remained seated, but she looked as though she were being physically pressed into her chair. Her eyes were fixed on the inheritance papers, her fingers digging into the edge of the table so hard that her red lacquered nails began to splinter against the wood. She was watching her future dissolve into a pool of spilled wine, and for the first time in 35 years, she had no script left to play. I stood up slowly, making no sound at all, my eyes moving over Jerry as if I were assessing a piece of equipment that had suffered a catastrophic, irreparable failure. I didn't raise my voice to meet his. I reached out and gathered the documents, using a clean corner of a napkin to carefully dab away the wine from the plastic sleeve. My movements were slow and exact, the same way I would navigate a suture line on a patient's chest, my focus entirely on the preservation of the truth. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Aunt Ruth, who was standing a few feet away with her own folder clutched to her chest. I pulled a large, reinforced envelope from my bag, placed the damp documents inside, and wound the string around the button with a steady, practiced motion. I felt a strange, light sensation in my fingertips, the weight of 5 years of exile finally detaching itself from my skin, as I realized that their anger no longer had a place to land. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps firm and rhythmic on the carpet, and I didn't look back at the wreckage of the dinner or the people still seated in the golden glow of the chandeliers. As I passed Monica, I reached into my pocket one last time and placed a folded slip of paper beside her plate. The itemized list of the hospital bills I had guaranteed to keep her alive while she was telling the world I was a thief. I didn't stop to explain. I walked straight through the revolving doors and out into the cold, sharp air of the Hartford night. The streetlights cast long blue shadows across the pavement, and the hum of the city felt like a welcome, honest vibration after the stifling silence of the restaurant. I reached up and adjusted the collar of the white coat I was still wearing beneath my blazer, feeling the cold air fill my lungs and wash away the lingering scent of lavender and the sourness of my father's breath. I caught my reflection in the darkened window of a storefront, and I didn't see the girl who had spent a lifetime waiting for Jerry's approval. I saw Irene, the woman who had signed the papers to save her sister, and then signed the papers to save herself. I understood then that the truth doesn't require an apology to be effective. It only requires a person who is willing to stand in the middle of the storm without flinching. Speaking the truth might not bring a resolution or a hug at the end of the night, but it brings a clarity that can never be taken away once it has been spoken. It is the first step toward a life that doesn't belong to anyone else. If you believe that standing in your own truth is the only way to truly begin living, then you know exactly why I didn't feel the cold as I walked toward my car. Please leave a like if you have ever had to choose between a family's lie and your own sanity, and share your thoughts in the comments about the moment you finally chose yourself. As I drove away from the Capitol Grill, the rearview mirror showed a small, lonely silhouette of Diane standing on the sidewalk, watching my car disappear, as if she were watching a dream of social standing finally disintegrate. The aftermath of the truth was already beginning to move through the community, traveling faster than any of the lies Monica had ever whispered into the ears of our relatives. Everything they had used as a cage, their reputation, their status, and even the promise of an inheritance, was beginning to buckle under the weight of the reality I had left on that white tablecloth. I could almost hear the sound of the house in Hartford starting to settle, the foundation cracking as the secrets that had held it up for decades were finally exposed to the light. 2 months have passed since that evening at the Capitol Grill, and the air in Hartford has grown cold and thin, carrying the sharp scent of wood smoke and the quiet weight of a season ending. The truth about the $250,000 did not just ripple through our family, it tore through the social fabric Diane had spent decades weaving with such careful, frantic precision. The book clubs and the charity circles my mother once dominated have become quiet rooms where her name is now a footnote in a cautionary tale about the cost of a lie. I sit in my office at Mercy Rest, the large window framing a view of the hospital grounds blanketed in a heavy, pristine white snow that seems to muffle the chaos of the city outside. I watch the flakes fall, a silent accumulation of time, while I review the recovery statistics of the patients whose lives were placed in my hands this week. The data is precise and orderly, a reflection of the work I have done and the position I have earned, providing a stark contrast to the hollowed-out world I left behind on that wine-stained tablecloth. In the house on the hill, the world has shrunk into a singular gray room that smells of stagnant air and unwashed fabric. Jerry stands by the living room window, his fingers clamped onto the heavy, dust-caked curtains as he stares out at the for sale sign vibrating in the winter wind. The wood of the sign is already beginning to peel, the red lettering a glaring reminder of the equity he can no longer claim. He holds a foreclosure notice from the bank, his dry, weathered fingertips tracing the words past due mortgage payment until the ink smudges under the pressure of his grip. His shoulders are slumped, a frame of a man who no longer has a daughter to bankroll his pride or an audience to applaud his manufactured success. He does not turn on the lights when the sun begins to set. He sits in the shadows of the late afternoon, the only sound in the house being the rhythmic, dry ticking of the old grandfather clock, a lone survivor of a grand facade that has finally collapsed under its own weight. Diane sits at the dining table, her hands trembling as she sorts through a stack of invitations returned to sender, the neighbors she once looked down upon now refusing to acknowledge her existence. She strokes her silver hair and stares at the pale rectangles on the wallpaper, where Monica's theatrical photos used to hang, the silence of the house becoming a physical weight that she cannot escape. Monica appeared at my office door without an appointment, the celebrity she once claimed to be nowhere in sight. Her expensive designer coat was frayed at the hem, and her high heels were stained with the gray slush of melting snow from the parking lot. She stood in the doorway, her hand reaching out as if to touch the sleeve of my lab coat before she saw the silver Chief of Surgery nameplate and pulled back with a sharp intake of breath. Her head was bowed, her hair falling over a face that had grown hollow and sharp in the week since the truth came out. Her hands were locked together in front of her chest, a frantic attempt to hold on to the fragments of a dignity she had traded away for a story. She stepped back when I stood up from my desk, her breathing short and shallow as she stared at the medical journals stacked neatly in the corner. "Jerry kicked me out," she said, her voice a thin, brittle thing that barely carried across the room. "He spent the last of the inheritance trying to fight the audit, and when the money was gone, he told me he never wanted to see my face again. You are the only person left I can call, Irene." I did not reach out to embrace her, nor did I offer a lecture on the 5 years of exile she had forced upon me. I simply placed a bottle of mineral water on the edge of the desk and stepped back, maintaining a professional distance that felt like a necessary barrier for my own survival. I looked at the long, faint scar on her forehead, the result of the procedure I had performed to save her life, and I saw a woman who had finally run out of scripts to play. She pulled a handwritten confession from her pocket, the paper wrinkled and stained with the salt of dried tears, and laid it down beside the water bottle. She did not ask for a place to stay, or for a loan. She simply turned and walked away, her shoulders hitching in silent sobs as she moved down the long, echoing hospital corridor. I picked up the paper, my fingers tracing her admission of the forgery and the lies, but I did not feel the heat of a victory. I felt the cold, quiet settling of a debt that had finally been acknowledged by the person who had created the vacuum in the first place. I folded the paper and placed it in the locked drawer of my desk, next to the legal documents Aunt Ruth had provided. I picked up the phone and called a lawyer to finalize the transfer of the remaining funds back into the charity Grandmother Jun had loved, ensuring the money would finally go toward the community instead of a lie. I walked out of my office and toward the hospital's winter garden, where the pine trees were standing firm under the weight of the heavy snow. I sat on a wooden bench, brushing away the white powder with my hand, and watched a single snowflake land on my palm. It was a perfect, intricate crystal that melted into a drop of warmth against my skin. I understood then that justice isn't always a hammer, Sometimes it is the silence of a house where the laughter has died, and the truth simply performs its own natural clearing of the ground. Jerry and Diane lost what they tried to steal because they built their lives on sand. And the storm I brought was only the catalyst for a collapse that was already inevitable. When you stop sacrificing your own worth for people who refuse to acknowledge it, the world has a way of reorganizing itself around the truth. I have spent a lifetime trying to fix a foundation that wasn't mine to repair, only to realize that my own peace was the only structure that ever mattered. Have you ever witnessed the truth demanding its own justice without you having to lift a finger? Please share your story in the comments and leave a like to support the journey toward healing. We are all learning that some bridges are meant to stay burned so that we can finally walk onto solid ground. I stood up from the bench, the warmth from my coffee cup spreading through my hands as I walked toward the parking lot. The world of Jerry and Diane was shrinking into a small, isolated corner of Hartford, while my own was expanding into a future of my own choosing. The peace I felt wasn't because everything was perfect, but because the silence no longer belonged to them. As I reached my car, the phone in my pocket began to vibrate with a familiar, persistent rhythm. I pulled it out and looked at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the darkened glass of the windshield. Mom calling. The display read, a name that once would have made my heart stop in my chest. A year has changed the way the air feels in my lungs, or perhaps it is just the absence of the artificial lavender oil that used to coat every surface in Hartford. My new apartment sits high above the downtown streets, a fortress of glass and light, where the only scents are the bitterness of morning espresso and the damp earth of the potted cacti I've lined up along the floor-to-ceiling windows. This space belongs to me in a way that no room ever did in the house Jerry and Diane built. Every object here was chosen by my own hands, and every silence is a deliberate choice, rather than a forced suppression. It is a sanctuary where the past cannot reach me without my permission, and on this specific Sunday morning, the pale yellow sunlight feels like a weightless blanket across my shoulders as I navigate the quiet of my own life. I stand before the windowsill holding a small ceramic watering can, the glazed turquoise surface cool against my palm. I move with a slow, rhythmic precision, pouring thin streams of water into the base of a pothos plant that has begun to climb the spine of my bookshelf. I watch the dark soil soak up the moisture, the water disappearing into the parched earth as the small white aerial roots reach out toward the glass. I set the watering can down on the mahogany shelf and let my index finger trace the textured spine of a thick anatomy textbook, the coarse paper and the faint scent of fresh ink acting as a physical anchor. This career was bought with a decade of blood and tears that Jerry and Diane never saw. A foundation of knowledge that stands as the only thing they couldn't find a way to take from me. I move toward the small cabinet in the corner of the room where I've placed a single framed photograph of Grandmother Jun. In the picture, she is laughing in her old Hartford kitchen, her frail, slender hands covered in flour as she reaches for a rolling pin 15 years ago. I pick up a soft microfiber cloth and wipe away a nearly invisible layer of dust from the glass, my movements careful and steady, as if I were closing a delicate suture. I place the photo back in the center of the shelf, right next to the silver stethoscope that has survived 1,000 trauma shifts. I stand back and fold my hands together, looking into her eyes and feeling a quiet, wordless connection that vibrates through my chest. In this apartment, her memory is the only part of Hartford that is allowed to stay, a reminder of the version of me that was always enough. The sudden vibration on the coffee table cuts through the stillness, the rhythmic buzzing of the phone sounding like a persistent insect in the quiet room. The screen illuminates, displaying the words "Mom" calling in a stark digital font. I walk over and stand over the device, watching the light flicker against my fingertips as they rest on the edge of the table. I do not feel the familiar, sickening jolt in my diaphragm or the sudden urge to apologize for an existence I didn't choose. I simply observe the phone, counting the vibrations with a clinical detachment, watching the name pulse against the glass until the call finally ends and the screen returns to a cold, black silence. I reach out and pick up the phone, turning it face down on the thin wool rug, a singular and decisive movement that signals the end of a chapter. I leave the door open for their existence, but I no longer allow them to step across the threshold into the air I breathe. I turn away from the phone and walk toward the kitchen, where the scent of jasmine tea is beginning to rise from the porcelain pot. The doorbell rings with a soft, melodic chime, and I move to open it without hesitation. Monica is standing there, holding a small basket of seasonal fruit, her face looking clearer and more settled after months of therapy and the quiet work of rebuilding a life without a script. I take a step back and gesture for her to enter, my hand guiding her toward the oversized armchair near the window where the sunlight is at its peak. I pour a cup of the hot tea and set it on the small table in front of her, the rising steam momentarily blurring the faint silver scars on her forehead. We sit in the light, the silence between us no longer a catalyst of exclusion, but a space where we are learning to exist without the shadows of the people who used to dictate our worth. We talk about the small plans for the upcoming month, the progress of the June Foundation, and the way we are both learning to live without the constant, suffocating presence of Jerry and Diane. I watch Monica take a slow sip of the tea, her eyes no longer darting toward the corners of the room in search of a camera or a cue. She looks at me directly, a late but sincere acceptance visible in the way she holds her glass, a first bridge being built on a foundation of truth rather than appearance. We are two people who were nearly erased by the same system, now choosing to recognize each other in the light of the morning. There is no performance here, only the steady heat of the tea and the realization that we are finally free to be the daughters we were meant to be. I realize then that family isn't found in the names written on a birth certificate, but in the people who are willing to stand with you in the truth, even when the truth is a storm. I have traveled from the darkness of invisibility to the clarity of autonomy, and the greatest gift I received wasn't an inheritance, but the power to own my own narrative. The boundaries I have set aren't a wall of hatred. They are a circle of safety so that I can finally learn how to love without being consumed. Leaving isn't an act of betrayal. It is a desperate act of self-rescue that requires more courage than any silence ever could. If you have stayed with me until the end of this journey, thank you for witnessing the moment Irene finally came home to herself. If this story has touched a nerve or given you the strength to draw your own line in the sand, please leave a like and share it with someone who is still sitting in the dark. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey toward healing. Where is your real family today? Leave a comment below and let me know I'm not the only one who had to walk away to find the way back. The noon sun grows brighter, washing away the last of the winter chill from the windowsill as Monica stands to leave. She offers a small, genuine smile and a promise to meet for a walk next weekend, a rhythm of connection that feels honest and sustainable. I close the door and lean my back against the solid wood, listening to the steady, peaceful beat of my own heart in the quiet of the apartment. My journey has landed safely in a place where the truth is no longer a tool for damage, but the firm ground beneath my feet. I walk back toward the window, looking out over the city as the shadows begin to shift, ready for a future where the only voice I have to answer to is my own.